Good day to you. I really enjoyed hearing the stories from you guys about some of your travels. And listen, I don't want you to feel at all inferior or feel bad about yourself if you haven't been able to travel to see the world. I mean, it's just great to be able to head to the shore, or to head to New York, or head down to Florida, as some of you talked about. Really, for myself, I didn't start traveling until I was 22. And I took a risk, like many of you did when you have done some of your travels for spring break and whatnot. At 22, I went to see my parents in the south of England. And I really wanted to go to Amsterdam. I was determined to get there, but there's no way that I could have afforded a plane flight. I was a poor grad student. So I did the only option that I could, and that was to buy a really cheap motorcycle. I decided to drive it all the way to Amsterdam, about a 6-hour trip when you take out the ferry portion of it. So I set on my journey from England, and I got on the ferry, and when I arrived in Belgium, it was stone cold. It was raining, kind of like it's doing now in my backyard. And I was freezing, but I was excited because I knew I was going to get to drive on the Autobahn as I went up through Belgium into Holland. The Autobahn is a German highway system, but you can also find it in Belgium and Holland, and it's a highway where there are no speed limits, so I was really excited about driving fast to get there fast. Unfortunately, when I got up to 50 miles an hour or so, my rain slicker, which is the only thing I had to wear, would open up like a parachute, and it would slow me down on the highway and make it dangerous. So I ended up having to go 55 miles per hour as all these Mercedes were passing me. When I finally got to Amsterdam, I was lost. I was looking for a campsite, and I pulled up on the sidewalk, and there was an elderly lady coming out of a grocery store, and there were two people in front of me asking her questions. The first person was asking her a question in French, and she answered. The second person asked a question in, I believe, German, and she answered in German. And then I asked her my question where the campsite was in English, and she told me in English. I was blown away by the fact that this lady, who I knew nothing about her background, was able to speak in 3 different languages. It was an amazing trip, and I ran out of gas on the way home in England and had to walk back the next day and get my motorcycle. I was so poor. And as a side kind of humorous note, when I got back to my house and I told my mom and dad the story of my rain slicker, my mom said to me, "Why didn't you just turn it around and put the buttons behind you?" And I thought, yeah. Anyway, that was a risk that I took, and it also taught me how small the world is and how you can enter a microcosm of cultures. In my case, only 7 hours, that's going to consist of really different looking peoples and different languages, different tastes, different sights and sounds all around you. And it really explored for me the idea that the world is this absolutely huge place that consists of so many different cultures and sounds and tastes, etc., that I just mentioned. It's impossible to take it all in. And so that's what we're heading into now in Chapter 1 of the book, as we develop this video instructor lecture to talk about how big the world is and where media plays a role in that world. And so how big is the world? Well, it takes 2 days to fly around on a jet airplane. That's a lot of time to be flying, and it shows you the scale of the world. And when you do fly across the world or around the world, you go through 22 time zones. We have 4 here in the United States. Russia, just to compare that country to us, has 11 time zones. Imagine programming television for a country with 11 time zones. You're putting on a TV show at 7 o'clock at night in one place, and it's 6 o'clock in the morning in another place. How do you do that? It's quite difficult. Also, you'll cross 7,000 languages. 7,000. I speak one and a quarter, poquito español. Some of you maybe speak 2 languages, and the lady that I met or that I talked to in Holland spoke at least 3 languages. So imagine 7,000 languages across the world. And one thing that I bet you didn't realize is that the number 1 language in terms of the number of people who are speaking it in the world is Chinese. It's Mandarin Chinese. But that language is concentrated mostly in one part of the world around China, so you wouldn't think about that. And the second most spoken language is Spanish, which is mainly spread throughout the world during the Spanish colonial imperial period. English is only in the 3rd position. However, English is the most spoken language within media content and is the most spoken language within web and internet content. And that's why you can easily grow up thinking that English is the most popular and most spoken language in the world, but it is not. So when I wrote this book, I decided to compare 4 traditional media. When I wrote the book, social media were not that well developed at that time. Otherwise, I would have included them in this book. And I'm going to try to find a way to work social media into our class as we go throughout the semester. But this book concentrates on the 4 traditional media. You've got television, you've got radio, you've got newspapers, and you've got magazines. Those are the 4 traditional media that I focus on. And the countries that I selected for this book, it's a little Eurocentric. I mean, I have 3 countries that are focused on Euro because I wanted to write the book on countries that I had enough expertise to write on with authority. So the 3 countries that are in Europe, Sweden, France, and England, Sweden, France, and the UK, I should say, those were easy for me. The other countries, China and Lebanon, that were not that easy for me, I actually shipped out the writing, outsourced it, if you want to call it that way. I had 2 other authors contribute the material in those countries, and I shaped it as the editor of that material. But for each country, each one presents a very interesting, I would say, prism to look at media systems. China, for example, is a country that's thought of as a communist, authoritarian country, but it actually has a lot of capitalism in it. If you go to China, you'll find a lot of free markets going on. You'll find a lot of sales that are based on supply and demand. And certainly Hong Kong, which China absorbed in the year 1999, is almost completely capitalistic. So it's a very interesting system, the Chinese media system. We'll see how capitalism has strong doses in its media system as we go throughout the course. France is an interesting country as well. It's different from the other 2 European countries because the government plays a strong role in both regulating media and also developing media, especially developing media that's going to promote the culture of France, the wines of certain regions, for example, or the cheeses of certain regions. The French government wants to make sure that French culture stays alive and supports that in media. Ghana is a very interesting country too, kind of like Mexico. It had a long reign of a particular political party. It was a dictatorship and only experienced freedom about 16 years ago in terms of the electoral process and democracy coming to the country. And that plays out in the way that it's regulated, or rather in the way that there is a reluctance to regulate media in Ghana. When it comes to Lebanon, you've got a country that's still suffering from a very long civil war and is on the what you might call the doormat or the welcome mat of the Middle East. When those European colonial powers went into the Middle East, everybody had to go through Lebanon. You sailed across the Mediterranean and went through Lebanon. So Lebanon has a long history of foreign invasion as well as a civil war, as well as a composition amongst the population of many different fragments of people, many of whom define themselves by religion. And that plays out in the way that Lebanese media is developed. Then you've got Mexico, which, like Ghana, had a long history of a particular political party in power, a lot of corruption, a lot of intimidation that went on, especially towards journalists who wanted to criticize the government. And it shows itself now in the way that Mexican media is developed in terms of the freedoms that they have, but still some of the corruption that exists. And we'll continue our discussion about that. And then the drug cartels, by the way, is something else that plays a big role in Mexican media, and we'll talk about those as well. Then you have Sweden. Sweden is a very stable country. It's a small country with a small population, and the Swedes have decided that if they want to have any interchange with the world, they have to learn a foreign language, and it's going to be English. So they actually use media, and television in particular, to teach Swedish young children how to speak English at a very early age. And that's why when you go to Sweden, you can talk to anybody just about, and they're going to speak fluent English with you. You've got the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is an island. It has an island mentality. It certainly had that this summer when it voted to exit the European Union, what it was called as Brexit. It's leaving this group of countries that came together in an association that's not too dissimilar from the United States and all our states coming together. But in Europe, you have so many big differences, kind of like I described in my 7-hour trip. That's much harder to do. And Britain has decided it's part of its island mentality that it's going to opt out of that. And we'll see how that island mentality also plays out in terms of its media. And then we have the United States. The United States is a very capitalistic media system. It's based very much on a libertarian model, which we'll discuss in chapter 4 on philosophies. Libertarian means government hands off. Don't get in the way. Don't get involved. And so we let the commercial marketplace dictate a lot of what the United States does, and that plays out in terms of its media system too. That's why you see so many advertisements on television. That's why you hear so many on radio. That's why the newspaper is laid out after the advertisements are laid out. And that's just in general why you see so many commercials in U.S. culture. So we're going to be studying these countries. However, you can take the concepts from this book and you can apply them to any country that you've been to. One of you in this class mentioned you've been to Italy, for example. You can apply the concepts from this book to countries outside of the ones that we're talking about in this book. Now, the book has as a key term in its title, comparing. The book is called Comparing Media. The class is called Comparative Media. And that term is very, very important because when you compare something, you learn your point of reference. You learn who you are in relation to others. And so when I went to Holland, I thought, those people are so tall. Every time I'm talking to somebody, it's like this. I'm looking up at them. They're tall and thin, generally speaking, as a population. In learning that they're tall, I'm also learning that I'm short. It's developing a point of reference for me by comparing. And so we are going to develop what our point of reference here is in the United States by studying other cultures' media systems. And that is another key word, media system. Because when you look at a TV show, you can't look at it in a vacuum as it exists only in and of itself and really learn about the depth of how that TV show came into being. You need to study how the TV show is part of a system. And so that's what this book does. That's what this class does. It looks at media systems as a way of understanding media from around the world. More about that in Chapter 3 when we talk about specifically what a system is. One of the other features that I want you to gain from this course is to overcome something that I call cultural myopia. Cultural myopia. Myopia is short-sightedness. It's actually an optometry term. And if you're short-sighted, you can't see very far in the distance. And so I borrow that term to invent this phrase, cultural myopia, to describe how when we look at something from afar that's blurry to us because we're unfamiliar with it, we tend to apply what we know that is close up to us to understand the object that is far. The example that I use is people often describe English beer as being warm beer. Well, that's cultural myopia. Because you're discussing English beer in terms of your own beer that you're used to drinking. And in the United States, most beer, although we have seen microbrews change this idea of most beer lately, but most beer that's drunk is still lagers, and Budweiser, Coors, Nat Ice, etc. Keystone, all the cheap stuff that college students drink is meant to be refrigerated. English beer is more commonly of the ale variety. Yes, you have stouts, you have lagers as well. You even have shandies, which is a combination of beer and lemonade. It's designed to introduce people slowly to the idea of alcohol so that they don't develop binge drinking tendencies. Not sure it works. If you've ever been to England, you'll know what I mean. But in England, most beer, at least what England is known for, is the ale. And the ale has a very specific temperature that it's meant to be served at. I think it's 57 degrees, because that's what releases the flavors. It also has to do with the way that beer is brewed. And so English beer is not really warm. You wouldn't say 57 degrees is warm, would you? It's just warmer. And that very subtle difference between calling something warm or warmer points out cultural myopia. Cultural myopia is looking at another system and evaluating according to your own system instead of evaluating on its own terms. We'll develop that concept more as we go throughout this course. This book also has what is known as a rhetorical perspective. That's what I have my Ph.D. in rhetoric. We actually have several courses in our department based in rhetoric. A rhetorical perspective does not assume that things are automatically one way when you try to interpret those things. I know this is vague, so bear with me for a moment. A rhetorical perspective basically says that you are invited by media content to perceive of things in a certain way. Think of it this way. When you go into a bank and you see high marble countertops and you see multiple solid doors that you have to get through and you see very clean surroundings, what are you invited to believe by all that imagery about your money? You're invited to believe that it's safe, that it's not going to get lost, that nobody can go in there and steal it, that nobody is going to shortchange you because of incompetence. You are invited by those surroundings to believe that your money is safe. The same can be true for media. Media can invite you to believe that media are free or are not free, that media are able to address political concerns or are not able to address political concerns. Basically, you're being invited by the form of the media. This is also a concept I want you to bear with me on as we develop it throughout the course, how you were invited by a French magazine to perceive of that magazine. This course and this book has a rhetorical perspective. The book itself I organized, I think, uniquely, which is why the publisher was interested in it. Most of the books written that have to do with comparing media are written from the point of view that each chapter is on one particular country. So you have the chapter on China, and you'll go through radio and TV and newspapers, etc. The problem with that organization scheme is by the time you get to the end, it's very difficult to remember what China looked like when you are now reading about Costa Rica, or you are now reading about Lebanon. It's very difficult to remember. So I slice it a different way. I slice the subject matter by taking a media system, breaking down that media system into philosophies, cultural characteristics, financing, content, news reporting. These are all examples of chapters in my book. I take a component, or an element, as I call it, of a media system, and then we compare that element across all the countries. I hope it works for you. I think it makes it easier to compare the countries in that way. And so that will wrap up our first video lecture that has to do with the content of the book. Today we have our first quiz. Typically when I design quizzes, I design them so that you have to have watched the video lecture. Of course you have to watch it for the quiz to be triggered, but also to do well on the quiz. And also I design the quiz so that you have to have read the chapter, so that there is a question that's coming out of the chapter or two that are not based on the video lecture. The quiz is 5 minutes long exactly, so be ready to time yourself. There will be a timer at the top of your D2L page to help you out as well. And you need to have read the book, in my view, in order to score as best as you can on that quiz. In the meantime, I want you to remember, the world is a really big place. Where have you been? Where will you go by the time that you pass away? Will it just have been in this area? Or will you get to venture over here, down here, over here? That's up to you. You often have to take risks to be able to do it, and that's part of the fun. Have a great day.